Dan researches neoliberalization and the corporatization of the university system in Canada. A rather interesting topic. As someone who went to the University of Waterloo, I remember, you know those Frosh t-shirts they give out? You know, they would list all of the names of the donor companies. And I remember one name in particular, Raytheon was on the list. And Raytheon, of course, is a major defense contractor and one of the largest producers of guided missiles in the world. So I was able to have a nice Frosh experience thanks to them. So once again, I'm talking about myself. But back to Dan. Dan's going to talk about student activism and student activists who are organizing around issues related to Palestine and the anti-war movement and what they've been up to. Dan?
Thanks, Umair. And I think the anecdote about your Frosh experience in Raytheon is a good segue to what I'm going to be talking about. So, basically, I'm just going to discuss some of my experiences and observations being in the Palestine Solidarity movement, organizing primarily on campus that hopefully you all will find useful. I'm part of Students Against Israeli Apartheid at York, which is York's Palestine Solidarity group, and it's also part of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which hasn't been mentioned yet. I'll talk very briefly about that before I move on to some more York-specific stuff. But the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, or the BDS movement, is a movement whose principles are rooted in human rights and international law. And it has three goals: to use the aforementioned tactics to end the occupation and colonization of Palestine and tear down the wall, to achieve equal rights for Palestinians inside Israel, and to secure the right of return for Palestinian refugees. And so the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement demands that, or the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement asks that to be in solidarity with Palestinians, these strategies are followed until Israel complies with international law. It's a global movement. It exists all over the world, from South Africa to Chile to London to the US. And it originates in a call-out in 2005 from 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, and which formed the Boycott National Committee. And it's not tied to any particular political party. And all of the major political organizations in Palestine agree on this strategy. So the idea is to pick strategic targets that have the most political impact. And a few of them have been SodaStream, which is a product that is made in illegal settlements. The G4S prison security company, which is infamous around the world, and is complicit in the imprisonment of Palestinian political prisoners, which include many children, and also providing technology to the Israeli occupation. And another target is, of course, universities, which I'm going to be focusing on later because of my work at York. The strategy originates from South Africans who fought against apartheid, and is a political strategy to delegitimize and expose Israeli violations of international law. And it includes all kinds of organizations, unions, academic associations, churches, grassroots movements, and more. So, recently, polls have shown increasing support for Palestinians amongst young people in both Canada and the US. And I think, it can be said at this point that support for Palestinian rights has more or less, or is at least approaching to, approaching the point where it's breaking into mainstream discourse, which I think is a remarkable achievement. And I think this is attributable to a number of things, but in particular, both Israel's own very explicit oppression of Palestinians, including a younger generation of people who have seen the bombing of Gaza in 2009 and 2014, just very egregious and brutal images coming out of that. And also, I think the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has, very aptly, taken advantage of this of these events to capitalize on that. And so, BDS, I think, is best understood as a sort of a portable strategy, and I think this is what accounts for its success, in part at least, is that you can implement it wherever you're at, in whatever institutions you're a part of, and it allows anyone to very easily spearhead and lead a BDS campaign. But increasing support doesn't automatically translate into big victories. And so I'm going to talk about the work at York that I've been doing over the years and hopefully give you an idea of that. I could rant for hours about my experiences with the York administration trying to get this done, but I'll spare you that. I'm going to try and give you a bit of a snapshot here. So at York, we, as Students Against Israeli Apartheid, eventually reached a point where we had, through a lot of hard work, got a lot of kind of important representative institutions on board, right? So we got the Graduate Student Union, QP 3903, which is the major labor union representing TAs and contract faculty, and the Undergraduate Student Union, which was a big accomplishment given that York's Undergraduate Student Union they represent, I think, 50 to 60,000 students now, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, in Canada. And that was a pretty big deal at the time. It got some mainstream coverage from major news outlets. And these groups endorsed boycott, divestment, and sanctions with the goal of committing themselves to helping to pressure the York administration to adopt, ultimately, a university-wide policy of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which we are still some ways away from, but that is the ultimate goal. And it's worth mentioning here that after we got the endorsement from the York Federation of Students, which was the undergrad student union, we held a rally. And for this, we received a ban for one term. We had our club status revoked. And this was around 2013, 2014. So it's worth mentioning this, I think, because it raises some important issues around the conversation around freedom of expression on campuses and campus democracy, what that might look like. And we can return to this later, I think, in the Q&A maybe, if you would like to discuss it further. Despite increased campus support for Palestine and making major strides in terms of endorsement, after we reached this point, the question became, what now? So what do we do now after we have all of this institutional backing, right, from the sort of major representative institutions on campus? So how do we translate this increase that we were seeing in kind of knee-jerk pro-Palestine sentiment into concrete victories? What was the next step? And so we thought about it. And for some time, SAIA had already been focusing on the divestment aspect of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, specifically on thinking about ways to get York to divest from arms manufacturers that sell weapons to Israel. And we also realized that if we wanted to really move the York Board of Governors on this issue, the ultimate authority of things that are going on at York, given its composition, people involved in various industries, the finance industry, real estate, mining, so very wealthy businessmen primarily. So given this composition, we also realized that simply going up to the York Board of Governors and proposing that they divest from Israeli apartheid would be probably be an unsuccessful endeavor. So we started to think about different ways of moving forward. And we met with many of our close allies on campus to think about this. And we concluded that we'd have to broaden our coalition building to attempt to make progress on this front. So we did some research, and we found out that York does not have a socially responsible investment policy and has invested in weapons manufacturers. And this is despite the fact that York is ostensibly, in its mission statement, committed to social justice. So this is a issue that we felt we could press against here. There was some room to do something around this. And so we saw this as an opportunity to expand our solidarity network at York. And so there are many large student groups at York that had either overt or kind of latent politicization around similar issues. For example, I'll give you two examples. There's the Tamil Students Association, has always been, for as long as I've been at York, quite politicized through the long-running resistance of the Tamil people to Sri Lankan state oppression. There's a large Tamil student population at York. It was also an opportunity to build bridges with Kurdish students who, at the time, were involved in protests around the Turkish state and Erdogan's continuous attacks on the Kurdish people in Turkey and beyond. So we felt that this latter engagement was particularly important given the role that both Turkey and Israel play in attempting to polarize the region along the lines of religious identity and racial identity. And in the latter category, that would be anti-Arab racism. So you see the Israeli state making a lot of overtures to the Kurdish movement. There was another reason why we felt that the time was ripe for this, which is related to what Masara was talking about. Lately there's been a lot of controversy around Canada's recent weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. There was a $15 billion weapons deal with the Saudi state in armored vehicles that are equipped with heavy weapons. And more recently, Saudi Arabia has become more publicly identified as a particularly extreme and authoritarian state with its invasion of Bahrain during the Arab Spring, its ongoing destruction of Yemen, and the killing of its own citizens, which Canadian vehicles played a role in. And so this has a particular resonance for Canada, which I recently read has actually shot up to the #2 exporter of arms to the Saudis after the United States. So in going forward with this and thinking about what we were how we could expand the coalition, with our allies, we decided to get together and we expanded, or we created the Why You Divest Coalition, which is a coalition of 5 groups on campus, which pursue the goal of getting the York Board of Governors to divest from arms manufacturers with the immediate goal of getting York to take its endowment fund in particular out of 5 different arms manufacturers, which I'm going to mention in a bit. So this is not straightforwardly a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. But what it does do is it offers the opportunity to build new friendships and alliances. It opens the door to new opportunities for solidarity and for outreach, and to many conversations that would otherwise have been a lot more difficult to initiate. And it does this by locating the Israeli state within the same frame as Saudi Arabia. So I think also that this campaign plays an important pedagogical role. The Palestine Solidarity message is retained through SAIA's participation in the coalition, while Israel is located within a broader network of regional actors, along with, say, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, that historically constitute the key pillars of American policy in the region, as well as highlighting the role that important sectors of capital, here the arms trade, play in relation to state policy. So the question is, what's next? So what we have done over the last few years with the Why You Divest campaign is we've got 7 out of the 9 college councils that exist at York on board with the campaign. This is ongoing work. And we have more than 80 endorsements from a variety of different community organizations. So we've done pretty extensive outreach, which is not limited to just cultural clubs, or political clubs, but also extends to various different cultural clubs, social clubs, humanitarian clubs even. So basically any different organizations that we can get on board with this, we want to bring them into this campaign. So what has happened since? So at York, there was a committee called the York University Advisory Committee on Responsible Investment. Okay, this was a committee that was set up by the York administration as a means to, what they call community consultation. And so the Why You Divest Coalition submitted a proposal to the York University Advisory Committee on Responsible Investment. The proposal was to divest from 5 companies in particular: BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Amphenol, and Textron. So these are some of the worst offenders here. These are all companies that have sold weapons to states that have used them to commit well-documented human rights abuses and war crimes. So we submitted our proposal, and the proposal was voted on inside the advisory committee, and it was passed overwhelmingly. And the next step would have been that the proposal would go on to the York VP Finance and Administration, and then to the investment committee of the Board of Governors, and then to the Board of Governors itself. So that's a lot of steps there that have not been reached. And the reason for that is because York responded to URACRI's passing, to the advisory committee's passing of the Why You Divest proposal by unilaterally suspending the committee's operations. Oh. Yeah. So, we knew that there would be some trouble along the way taking the institutional route here. We didn't really have any illusions about this. But even so, it's still pretty surprising at how egregious the York administration has been in violating its own procedures here. This is something that we've actually seen before also when they suspended Students Against Israeli Apartheid's club status, which I mentioned before. But York routinely just violates its own procedures and rules. So where are we at right now? We're currently discussing with allies what the next steps are going to be. And I think it's important here to emphasize the undemocratic nature of York University and many of the institutions in which we exist. And along with that, the need to find ways to democratize our institutions that clear a path that we can use to translate the sort of substantial passive support that we have for a lot of these things that we're involved in transform those into concrete victories. So, to emphasize the sort of undemocratic nature of York, I think as a barrier to the success of this campaign and many campaigns like it, I think that's very important. So campaigns to democratize these institutions are probably would be quite effective. So that was a major obstacle. I guess I'll just mention a few more that I've experienced, and many of my colleagues have experienced organizing in Palestine Solidarity. There's, you know, we exist in kind of a weird situation right now, where there seems to be at least a lot of passive support for Palestine Solidarity and Palestinian rights, translating that passive support for Palestine into active support. So there's a lot of support out there. It's just being able to do something with it, right? That's a challenge. We'll see what happens right now and what opportunities the current stuff that Steve mentioned regarding Jerusalem will bring. There's also the general sort of subsiding of the anti-war movement, both at York and in Toronto more generally, which has led to a dearth of leadership and solid kind of left-wing leadership on these issues, and the decline of a politics that's based in international solidarity. I can also speak to the effectiveness of having a leadership of these types of organizations that's internationalist and solidaristic in its perspective. But one of the things we see also right now is the rise of identity-based organizing rather than solidarity-based organizing. And particularly around BDS, I think this is an interesting development and a potentially dangerous development, because so far as my own experience in the Palestine Solidarity movement, it's always been characterized by participation from Palestinians and non-Palestinians working together, and I think that's a big part of its success, and I think it plays an important pedagogical role again, right? There's also, and I don't know, maybe Steve would probably know more about this, but the low level of organization in Palestine itself and the lack of a clear leadership and direction on the ground. There's a political vacuum. The major political actors are not very popular and discredited. There's a lack of unity. There's a lack of unity in the major political institutions. And so that poses a problem too. And lastly, the sort of opacity and confusion around the Syrian conflict has had the effect of sectarianizing intergroup dynamics in many campus Palestine Solidarity groups, and having very destructive effects on Palestine Solidarity organizing. So those are a few more obstacles on top of the one that I mentioned, the ones that I've mentioned previously, and maybe we can get to those in the Q&A. And that's it. I'll leave it there. So.
I should end. I prepared an ending sort of thing for you, so let me read it out, if I may, before you go. So I'll close the event in the same way that I began it, with a reference to Lord of the Rings. So there's a part in one of the novels, in the first novel actually, in the Fellowship of the Ring, where Gandalf the Grey, you guys know Gandalf, he's the powerful wizard, him and Frodo, who's the main character of the series, they're discussing some of the horrifying evils that are descending on Middle-earth. And Frodo tells Gandalf that he wishes that the terrible things that were happening weren't taking place while he was alive. And Gandalf responds by saying, quote, "So do I, Frodo, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." End quote. And I think we can take up a similar attitude when considering the injustices taking place in the Middle East as well as elsewhere. Thank you once again.